This first question, fairly simple. It's just to get an idea of what kind of businesses people are joining from or ones that you might be supporting. So if you are representing a business, what kind of business are you representing? But if you are someone who works with businesses, what kind of businesses do you work with? So great. Got us started around local government, sustainability and climate change. So let's wait a minute or so and give people a chance to answer this question. So a few different options already coming through: creative industries, education, charities looking to support local businesses, Winchester Action for Climate Change, great, NHS, healthcare, excellent. And if you can't use the Mentimeter for any reason, do feel free to share your comments in the chat. Extractives, SMEs, startups. Okay, so there's a real range here. Let's keep it going for another few seconds. Give everyone a chance to get on. Local businesses again. Okay, so yeah, so there's a bit of a mix. We've got some larger businesses, some smaller ones, and I'm just getting a bit of noise in the background, so I'm just going to ask you to put yourselves on mute if you can. While we go through this process, but feel free to unmute at any point. So finance, small businesses, management consultants, working internationally, again, local businesses. Okay, so a good mix. So I'm sure not everyone's had a chance to answer yet, but I'll move us on to the next question. Industrial sector, excellent. So next question. Very broad one here. This is all totally anonymous, so don't feel like anyone's going to have to justify their answer. But be really good to get some thoughts on what do you think is the role of business in climate action? So in responding to the climate emergency, what role can business play? So there's no right or wrong answer here, but this will be helpful in reflecting back later on when we think about what climate positive businesses really mean and how we look at moving towards that as a state, as a system. So leaders, innovators. Okay, great. So that's a role that businesses can play in demonstrating what can be done, what's possible, helping to normalize ideas, absolutely mainstreaming, making climate friendly operating at the standard. Innovation, absolutely. We'll be talking about innovation in quite a bit of detail. Again, leading role. Finance coming up, this idea of driving change, taking responsibility for emissions within your own activities in the supply chain, reducing your carbon footprint, net zero. So again, there's a real theme emerging there as well. Influence, again, this idea of impacting behaviors from the wider world. Again, innovation, net zero, communication, being agile and flexible. So there's definitely a few themes emerging around influencing others, around finance, around innovation, around leadership, longer term, not short term. So yeah, and that's an interesting dynamic between business and government. Often businesses can sometimes think longer term if they have the ability to do so. Act as role models, take responsibility. Again, yeah, absolutely. They can collaborate, lobby for tougher regulation. Absolutely, that's something I think we'll be touching on again later on. Contributing to sustainable supply chains, again, yeah, lending money. Okay, so some really key themes emerging here. A lot of these are quite systemic, and there'll definitely be things that will be useful to reflect on later on. Again, these themes of leading, of innovating, of demonstrating what can be done, giving people a voice. Yeah, really interesting idea. We'll definitely touch on later. Right, two more questions. So next one is, what do you think would increase momentum for businesses contributing to climate action? So what are the things that could happen? And these could be big things, they could be small things that would support the momentum we're seeing towards businesses contributing to climate action. So whatever you think that action is, however big or small you think it might be at the moment, what would support that momentum? Okay, so immediately some commonality emerging: legislation, regulation, incentives, tax relief. So yeah, really clear answers there. Collaboration over competition, guidance nationally and probably internationally and regionally as well, I would expect. Again, tax, legislation, legislation and regulation really coming up here. So yeah, definitely something that we'll want to pick up throughout the rest of this session. Business Advantage. Interesting to know more about what's behind that suggestion. Consistent business support. Yeah, absolutely. Information is key. Again, we'll definitely reflect on that. Having to pay the real cost for their resources, really interesting. So that the reality of existing in a system and understanding the impact that businesses might have on that. Again, reporting being compulsory, pressure groups, moral leadership, government incentives, again, the perception of falling behind other businesses. So that's an interesting counterpoint to the idea of collaboration over competition, potentially. Again, reporting, rules, having true cost accounting, increased corporate social responsibility reporting. So again, I think there's some commonality, but there are also some different ideas emerging, different directions that the idea of climate positive business could go in. Again, I'm sure we could continue. There's a few more coming through as well. And I'll share all these afterwards as well, so you can have a look, reflect on what's been said, but really useful to see these themes emerging. Right, I'm sure we could continue on that, but I'm going to move us on to the last question for now, which is the counterpoint to the momentum. What is creating resistance to businesses contributing to climate action? What are the things that get in the way of this happening as much as it could? Again, could be big, could be small, no right or wrong answers. Interesting to see how much commonality there is between this answer and the previous one, whether there are the same themes, but this is definitely something we will be looking at through the lens of positive tipping points. Okay, so neoliberalism, so a particular framework within which businesses might be operating. Information, lack of understanding, lack of consistency in policy and consistency in many areas, I would imagine as well. Pressure for short-term profits. Yeah, really interesting. First mover disadvantages. So maybe that's an interesting, again, counterpoint to the idea of innovation. There's a risk there for innovation. If you are the first person to move in a particular direction, that can come with positives, but also risks. Orientation towards profit, absolute profit over morality. So there are some clear conflicts there. Messaging is confusing. So again, that need for consistency. Cost benefits not always clear. Lack of understanding. Not enough resources. Yeah, absolutely. Not listening to kids. We'll definitely touch on that explicitly later on. Businesses thinking they can get away without taking action. So that links again to the need for regulation, legislation, overestimation of short-term benefits, undermining the long-term risks. Yeah, really interesting. Again, can you see yourself as part of that wider system? Perception of being less competitive, making changes. Yeah, really interesting. Things might not feel affordable. There's lack of funding, lack of scientific literacy, doesn't feel like a priority. Things are changing too frequently, the policies, the information, cost of living. Yeah, absolutely. These kind of intersectional compounded crises that are emerging all the time, being cut off from the effects of their business. Really interesting. Again, not being able to see themselves as part of that wider system, perhaps. Lack of consumer adoption. Definitely want to pick up on that. Confusing messages again. Lack of precedents, outdated systems, lack of media engagement. Not really thinking things through. Yes, so we don't have a habitable planet, we don't have customers, which seems quite simple, but is definitely operating in a kind of complex systemic mindset, which isn't always accessible to businesses. Brilliant. Some really interesting ideas there. Again, I'm sure we could kind of continue and have a whole session on that. But I want to move us on. Scared. Yeah, that's a nice one to finish on. The emotional aspect to this is really, really important. Okay, so that's really helpful framing, just getting us thinking around what are the things that might create momentum and the things that are creating resistance. And so this links on to the idea of tipping points. So I'm just going to skip to my presentation now. And I'm going to spend about 15 minutes or so just talking through this in a bit more detail. Very happy to answer questions. So as I'm going, if things don't quite make sense, do feel free to stick your hand up or put something in the chat, and I can certainly clarify things. There's a lot more information out there, which I will share in the follow-up email, but I'll just give an overview to begin with. And so first of all, to say, as this slide shows, that this session is part of a series that I've been running through October and November, looking at applying this idea of positive tipping points in practice in various different sectors or ideas, so things like climate justice and food systems and social movements. So this is the one around climate positive business. Next week, looking at donor economics, and then the week after that, more of an open space session about what do we do next with this idea. So climate positive business. So we've already talked about innovation. That's already come up as a key part of how businesses can be climate positive. And I'm not going to get into a definition of climate positive just yet, but that might be something that Chris and I might talk about later on. But this idea of innovation is absolutely, clearly really important. It's a key thing that businesses can offer. But it sometimes does get overstated in terms of the role of innovation. And one of the things I'll be talking about is the importance to think about systems at the same time. So think about innovations as being important, but how do we locate them within the wider system? And one of the things I'll talk about is the idea that you can have innovation, but if it doesn't understand the system in which it's operating, or it doesn't connect to that system, then innovations can very easily fail. They cannot have the impact that you might be hoping for. They could have a counterproductive impact. So we really need to think of innovation, but also think about what else is happening within the system that allows innovations to be successful, but not just innovations as well. Keeping doing the things we already know are useful. Innovation isn't always the answer. So then, to talk about tipping points explicitly, when some of you might be familiar with the concept of tipping points, with the phrase, and predominantly the most common thing that we think of when we hear about tipping points, or the most common messaging that comes out, takes form into two ways. One, it is ecological, and two, it is generally negative. So this is how we commonly hear about tipping points. So here are some examples of negative ecological tipping points. We've got deforestation, we've got glacial melt, we've got changes in weather systems like monsoon seasons. So these are ecological systems where we're noticing that we're reaching a point where sooner or later we won't be able to stop the drastic negative impacts that these ecological changes will be having. So they will become, we're having huge momentum towards a negative shift. Yeah, great point in chat. Malcolm Gladwell's done some interesting work around this. So it's an idea that people are definitely understanding. However, this is not the only form that tipping points can take. So this is a graph that takes those ecological negative tipping points and puts them in a bit of perspective. This is from some research done by David Armstrong McKay from the University of Exeter, as well as others, looking at how close are we to these negative ecological tipping points. So when might we, assuming we are on a consistent trajectory of warming, when might we reach the point where we can't avoid these systems from reaching a tipping point from which we can't come back from them, from which the things might not have happened yet, but we can no longer avoid them because of what's already in the pipeline. And this was the basis of a conference that took place in Exeter in September this year. Lots of different organizations from around the world coming together to think about what do we know about tipping points at the moment that are talking about climate crisis, but how can we also use that framework to look at positive transformations? So look at tipping points, not just from an ecological perspective, but also technological and sociological, but also shift as well, not just looking at negative tipping points, but look at the positive things as well. Where are the areas where we can really focus our energy to find those tipping points that will more likely lead us towards a fair, just, habitable future? And so one of the things to note about this is very live work. This is live research. There isn't a kind of a clear conclusion yet. This is happening at the moment. And one of the key things that came out of the conference was this idea of, okay, so what do we do with this now? So that's the context in which these workshops are happening. sharing this idea of where we've got to at the moment, collecting feedback on that, inviting more people to be part of this conversation to make sure it's not just happening at an academic level, that this idea is being tested in the real world with sectors and organizations that could benefit from thinking in these terms. So a useful frame, an important frame to start with when we're thinking about systems is the difference between a complicated system and a complex system. So this is a helpful frame to get into the mindset of tipping points. So a complicated system is represented here by a bicycle. So a bicycle is an understandable system. There's a correct answer to it. So you could take it apart again, you can put it back together. It's predictable. You know, if you turn this lever or move this handle, you know what's going to happen. And to be able to understand this system, you need expertise. So you can learn how to do that. And it's a very self-contained system. A complex system, on the other hand, represented here by a cyclist. So you put a person on the bicycle and suddenly it becomes a different matter. It becomes complex. So it's not fully understandable. We don't know exactly what's going to happen to this system or how it's going to operate. There is no correct answer here. It might be partially predictable. We might know what the weather is like. We might know something about the time of day that this person's traveling, but we won't know everything about the traffic, about their state of mind, about what they had for breakfast, for example. So expertise is helpful here, but what we really need in order to be able to operate and interact with this system is perspective. That's what really helps us here. And this understanding is that there is no one correct answer. So this is really important because as human beings, we're very good at treating complex systems as though they are complicated. And there's a very good reason for this, because it allows us to take action. It allows us to quantify things. And it's important that we're able to do that to an extent, as long as we don't lose sight of the fact that we are dealing with, when we talk about climate, a complex system, for which there is not one right answer. Or to put it more visually, I think this cartoon for me really conveys this idea really well. We're very good at being inside our little box, thinking about, okay, we're going from A to B, here's how we do it. And then every now and then we remember that the world outside is slightly more complex than we sometimes give it credit for. And now this can be really overwhelming. This can make us feel powerless. Whether we're a business or any other organization, it's quite easy to think about this and think, well, what can we do? How on earth can we make an impact in such a complex and overwhelming system? And so this is where the idea of tipping points and the positive tipping points framework helps to acknowledge that complexity, but put it into a framework that can actually be understood and worked through. So let's take an example. An example that's directly relevant to businesses is one of fossil fuel divestment. Okay, so this is the idea that activists, organizations are lobbying and encouraging businesses and all sorts of organizations to divest from fossil fuels. So that means stop investing in organizations that are involved in, directly or indirectly, in fossil fuels, therefore not contributing to the fossil fuel economy and industry. And there's a lot of attention around this. There's loads of graphs you can find on the internet. Here's one I found, gofossilfree.org. And you can see here, there's a fairly steady line in the red lines, which is the number of institutions that are committed to divestment. And then the black line, which goes sharply upwards, represents the kind of the total of assets that have been committed in terms of divestment. And you can see there's a real shift, there's a real hike there towards the end of it, almost doubling the amount of assets that are being involved. And so this graph doesn't really tell us anything. It's very hard to know exactly what's going on with the divestment movement as a result of just one graph. But it's this example, I think, is a helpful way to think about different ways of looking at this process through the different lenses of systems. So a simple approach to this is, the very basic concept that it is unethical to invest in fossil fuels. So that's the pretty simple argument to make. Therefore, we shouldn't do it. And then you would hope that everyone stopped doing it because it's a bad thing to do. Clearly, it's not quite that simple. So a complicated approach is, well, yes, we could divest from fossil fuels, but if we don't invest in these things, someone else is going to do it. So if we don't invest, that investment will still exist and someone else is going to come and do it. And so that's taking that problem and viewing it within a complicated phrase. Okay, there are moving parts to this simple system. It's not as simple as everyone's just going to stop doing it overnight. But if we take that one step further from complicated to complex, we can kind of take it from, well, someone else will do it until they won't. And there will be a point at which that is not the case. And you can't say that anymore because it will be so impossible to invest in fossil fuels potentially because of the public outcry, or simply because fossil fuels are clearly not the future, that won't be the case anymore. So this is what we're starting to get into, this idea of complexity, where there's no longer a right answer to this. We don't know when that point will come, when it's not going to be possible, but it's going to come at some point. So what does that look like? When will we get to that? And this is where this idea of tipping points comes in. Okay, there is no right answer, but we can tell a change is coming. But how do we understand? How do we interpret that change or that potential change and really help try and build towards it? So here's another example that's a bit more well-researched, which is the idea of electric vehicles. And there's kind of two reasons I want to share this one. The first is, I think it's a really good example of how tipping points can work in practice. So what this graph is telling you is the share of new vehicles that are electric vehicles in these countries. And you can see that Norway is way ahead of the rest of the countries in this list at 64.5%. Next closest is Germany at 13.6%. So that's a huge difference. So what is going on there? How can we think about what is it about Norway that is different? And so we can kind of boil down, there are various things that might make electric vehicles more frequently bought. Okay, so there are some very common themes here. So one is that the price of this change goes down. So in this context, the price of electric vehicles is going down. But that's largely happening in all of these countries. So that doesn't really tell us, well, why is one different than the rest? So another thing is that the quality goes up. So as we make more and more electric cars, we get better at making them. The batteries last longer, they're more efficient, they're more reliable. Thanks. Yeah, Richard's getting ahead of the game there in the chat. Norway has particular focus on hydropower as well, and their electricity grid. But again, quality going up is probably common across a lot of these areas. So there's other aspects. So the desirability goes up. So the more you see other people doing a certain thing, the more it feels desirable to you. Okay, maybe 10 years ago, buying an electric car feels a little bit weird. I don't want to be the only person with an electric car. But as I see more and more people buying them, it makes it a more desirable action to take. So again, that starts to tell us, well, maybe that could explain something, because if Norway gets above a certain threshold, maybe then it becomes more desirable. So is that something that's helping? Accessibility going up as well. So as well as the technology, the behavior being cheap, being high quality, it needs to be accessible. So this could be about the infrastructure in that country. So are there charging points that are reliable and accessible to people? In many of these countries, that's not necessarily the case just yet. So again, that could be a reason why it's slightly different in Norway. Another key factor, and there are lots, and I know Richard's alluded to one in the chat. And earnings, absolutely. That make it kind of different from country to country. One particular example might be in Norway. One of the things that's happened is a quite restrictive tax on non-electric vehicles, so diesel and petrol cars, which has shifted the cost of the alternative way up, which has a huge impact on the other conditions that I've listed here. So again, thinking about what's happening in other countries, maybe that's sometimes starting to happen, but it hasn't happened completely. Yeah, absolutely. Government incentives are really good examples. So there are a few things going on. And what else is happening? So you've already started to identify some of the other things that are happening in this context. So it's really important that we understand what is it that's behind this difference, that's behind this shift, if we are to encourage other countries to take similar changes and have similar impacts. Now, the second reason I wanted to share this example is because I think it gets to the point of positive and negative tipping points is quite a binary model, a binary idea, and clearly things are more complex than that. There are areas where one person's positive might be someone else's negative. And electric vehicles is a good example for that. So for some people, they represent a sustainable future. For some people, they represent a future that we need to get away from, where driving is not the dominant mode of transport. And for some people, it represents a stepping stone on the way to somewhere else. So again, I think that's something we also really need to bear in mind when we think about the idea of positive tipping points is, well, what is positive? What does that mean? And how confident can we be about the positivity of the future we're trying to achieve? So moving on, really want to reflect on a really key thing to keep in mind around tipping points. Now, it can be quite easy or quite tempting to use this idea to focus on, okay, well, what's the biggest thing that we can do? What's the key aspect that we can introduce that's going to have the biggest impact? And this is where we come back to this idea of innovation again. And innovation is a bit of a lure or a trap to focus on in terms of, well, if we can just get the right innovation in, then we'll be able to move mountains. And here's a quote from Professor Frank Giles from the University of Manchester, who spoke at the Tipping Points conference at Exeter. I'm just going to read this out. I think it's a really important bit of context. The thing that is really appealing to policymakers is the idea that we only have to do something really small, and then we see these huge effects, which is pretty misleading because it's primarily the efforts leading up to the tipping point where a lot of effort will actually be needed. So yes, we need to focus on what is that moment of tipping? What is that lever where the change starts to happen? But actually the key thing where we really need to focus is all of that time leading up to that point, whether that's an innovation or something else. All of the efforts leading up to the tipping point, this is where we need to put our focus. So to put that in context with the tipping points idea, here is an idea, an image that kind of represents what's behind this concept. So you can see it's slightly more complicated than the sort of linear A. We're at A and we want to get to B. And really what we're seeing here, what this is representing is an idea of kind of two forces. So the first one is resistance. So if assuming we start in basin A, so this is the state that we are currently in, and we want to get into basin B. Rather than it being a straight line between them, what we find is there is a lot of resistance in the way, and we have to push through that resistance. And that resistance can take many forms, and we'll talk more about that in detail. But you can largely think about this as, you know, all of the patterns and the systems that want the status quo to remain. They might be conscious or unconscious, direct or indirect, but there are a lot of forces that try and keep or resist change. So that's what we first have to overcome. And then the tipping point is the moment at which that resistance becomes momentum. So the tipping point, the key area we're aiming for is not basin B. It's not that new state necessarily, because once we get to that tipping point, we then move into a place of momentum, which leads to basin B, which leads to that new state. So we don't have to know exactly how we get from the tipping point to basin B, because we will then gather momentum. And again, thinking about electric vehicles is an interesting example of it. Feels like, well, there is a lot of momentum behind that in a lot of places, but is it everywhere? Think of renewable energy as well. Renewable energy is clearly at a point where there is a lot of momentum behind it, and there will continue to be innovations and policy that will support that, but it has clearly passed a tipping point in terms of here is a dominant form of energy that we need to move towards. So we're not at that end place yet, but we have passed the tipping point and we are in a place of momentum, more momentum than we have resistance. There's always going to be some resistance, but the tipping point is the moment where the momentum outweighs the resistance. So that's a very kind of simple way of conceptualizing it. And I'm going to add a little bit more detail to that now before we get into the idea of business as an example. So here's a scenario that's a helpful one to kind of put into this idea. Here are three headlines roughly saying the same thing, talking about a theme or a pattern that people are starting to notice of younger people refusing to work for organizations that don't share their values or don't have sustainability goals or clear or transparent policies. So now, whatever you think about whether this is real or not, whether this is true, again, this comes back to the idea of the divestment model. And put yourself in the place of a business and you try and employ a young person, or any person for that matter, and they say, no, I'm not going to come and work for you because of, your values don't meet mine in terms of environmental sustainability or regeneration, you might think, okay, well, I can just employ the next young person that comes along, or the next person that comes along. And again, like with divestment, that's true up until the point that it's not true. So here is an example of, we clearly haven't hit a tipping point yet, but there is a change emerging. And this could go many ways. This could suddenly disappear as actually people say, you know what, with the cost of living, I just want a job. I don't care who I'm working for. So we might see this completely disappear. Or we might see continue and gain momentum. And then there is a point where businesses are forced to take action, forced to be really transparent about their values if they want to employ or recruit people and keep people within their organizations. So this is a really interesting example of, we can see a change is coming, but we really don't know what that change is going to be, how significant it might be. So again, to come back to this model, it's really important that we don't fixate on this tipping point, on just that point, on just that tipping, whether it's an innovation or otherwise. And I've got two images here that serve, I think, as a really helpful example of this. So these two images represent climatic impacts. So we've got flooding and we've got drought. So these are two very real things that are happening around the world, in almost every country to some degree, so some more severe than others. And if we think about the UK, for example, but very relevant to many other countries, we've seen huge flooding and huge drought that's had a significant impact. And you might expect, well, that kind of climatic impact is surely going to be a trigger to a new state. So this thing has happened, it changes the way we live, and then we move towards that new system. But this is a really good example of that point of, actually, this thing happens, but the conditions aren't in place for the change to emerge, then we're very likely to tip back down to where we were. So we could move forward. If there's a flood, if there's a drought, if there's another big event, that could tip us into a new system, or it could push us almost all the way up this curve, but then actually we just slip back down because we get over it, we forget about it. We forget how hot the summer was, we forget how bad the floods were, we focus on the issues at hand, and the conditions aren't in place for that trigger, that impact, to have the desired effect, which is shifting us into a new system. So again, this is where thinking at it as a systemic change really helps us identify, well, is this intervention going to be enough to trigger a new state, to trigger that change? So to break it down, coming towards the end of this module, so to break it down into more detail, we can think about the process in 3 steps. And so these are the kind of the 3 pillars of the framework of the positive tipping points idea. So this first one is, we need to create the conditions for change. So if we want change to happen, those conditions need to be in place. And here that's represented by one person in many, that it's starting to emerge, these conditions for change. Once those conditions in place, what we need to find is the reinforcing feedbacks. And you can see in this image, that's kind of represented by pushing up that left-hand basin, which is effectively, in this kind of visual metaphor, reducing the resistance. So you're taking those conditions for change and you're reinforcing them, making them stronger, building them, reducing the amount of resistance until you get to the third point, which is where the trigger comes in. So innovation or other ideas, then this thing can happen that suddenly resistance shifts to momentum, and that system, that state can shift into a different way of being. So these are the kind of the 3 things that need to be considered. And to break that down in a little bit more detail, and we'll come back to this later on, here are some examples of what that might look like. So creating the conditions for change could take a number of forms. Here are some examples. This is not exhaustive, but it could be about the number of people. So a lot of studies suggest that if you have a smaller population size, it's easier for that change to emerge because it doesn't have to hit as many people. We need to have access to information. So we need to know about this change that is potential. It needs to be affordable. That could be financial. It could be affordable in terms of time. It needs to be quality. So again, thinking about electric vehicles or other examples, this change needs to feel like it is better than the alternative. It needs to be desirable. So that could be something that appeals to our values, or we see other people doing it, and we want to be part of that in group. And it needs to be accessible. People actually need to be able to use it, to get to it. And these are all things, if these things are in place, these conditions for change are in place, then it's much more likely that this change can actually happen. Now, the feedback loops, these are the things that then support those conditions, make them stronger, erode the resistance and build up the momentum. So critical mass is a fairly well-known example. You reach a certain number of people and suddenly that becomes the dominant idea. So that could, various studies suggesting that's anywhere from 5% to 20% of people. We start to build a critical mass. Economies of scale, very simply, is the more we do something, the cheaper it gets. Learning by doing, the more we do something, the better at it we get. So we practice. It reinforces our ability to enact that change. Coordination. Here is an idea where the more people that are doing something and come together to achieve that, the more that can be done. So rather than people acting in silos, they come together and collaborate. And social networks, which could be, a literal social network like Twitter or TikTok, or could just be the way information moves within a community. So these are examples of feedback loops that can support those conditions for change. So really erode that resistance, replace it with momentum. And then we get to the triggers. So these are, again, I've mentioned innovation, which can take many forms. It could be a new policy that comes in. People mentioned earlier in the Mentimeter around policy and legislation. That thing coming in could then trigger a change. It could be about widespread behavior change. People's behaviors take time, and those things can potentially happen if those conditions are in place. And investment, which again could be financial investment, it could be investment in time, in capacity, that comes in, that can make a huge impact. Or something like new information. One of the good examples there is around plastic straws, and David Attenborough's Blue Planet work, which certainly in the UK had a huge impact on people's awareness of marine pollution. But that wouldn't have happened without all of the groundwork being laid by building up people's respect for and interest in the natural world and the environment. So these triggers are really important, but they're very easy to over-fixate on. And if we don't have the conditions in place, we don't reinforce them with the feedback loops, then these triggers are likely to have little to no effect. So it needs to be happening at the right time. And this is why we need to look at the whole picture and the whole system, rather than just focus on those one-off interventions like innovation. So last slide, just another thing to throw into the mix before I bring Chris into the conversation, is this idea that it's even more complex than we're making out. So we could end up in basin B, taking this example, but think of this as a 3D image rather than a 2D image. You roll a ball to the top of a hill, you may know it's going to, then it's not going to stay at the top, it's going to end up somewhere else, but you can't 100% predict exactly where that ball is going to end up. So it can end up in any one of these other scenarios. And these scenarios, it could roll back to where it was. But if we look at these scenarios, C, D, and E, these are alternative new states. So these are new states which could potentially be co-opted by the current powers in place, or they could be otherwise undesirable states to be in. So just because change is coming, it doesn't necessarily mean that that change is going to be positive. So what that means is that this is a really, really important point to notice. This is the point where we start to notice these early warning indicators. It's the idea that the existing system or the existing regime is losing stability. So change is coming, but we don't entirely know where that change is going to end up. So again, young people not wanting to work for environmentally destructive organizations might be an example. We don't know which way that's going to play out, but it's clear that things are starting to change. Divestment is an example as well. So it's clear there's a momentum towards organizations divesting, but it could mean that it just clears the way for large organizations to come in and pick up all of that investment and put even more money into fossil fuels. So there's a few different ways that this could play out. So this is a really important thing to bring into this idea of it's not as simple as A to B. even within the context of the tipping point framework, there's a wider system at play. So there aren't, right, again, thinking about complexity, there aren't right answers here, but it's really important that we understand what is going on within the system. We really think in that systemic way. And that's why I think this framework can be really, really useful. So I'll stop sharing there. I'm going to bring in Chris in just a second. And towards the end of the session, we'll then look at, okay, well, how do we put this into practice? How can we actually use and engage with this model in a way that helps us break this down? Amanda, I see your comment about being a cheery thought. Absolutely. I mean, this can be a really positive idea, but it also can be really overwhelming if we think about how change can be co-opted in a negative way. Yeah, loads of really useful comments in the chat, which we can bring out in questions later on. But first, I want to bring in Chris from Low Carbon Devon, the University of Plymouth, to talk a little bit about his experience with business and perspectives around that, some ideas about what change is emerging, and then we'll start to feed that into this tipping points framework. And I'd really welcome some questions and discussions after that. But Chris, over to you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Peter. Good to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Peter said, I am from the University of Plymouth on a project called Low Carbon Devon, and I'm just going to share some insights, some thoughts, and maybe some provocations as well around what I've been working on. So my role is at Low Carbon Devon as a knowledge exchange officer. Hopefully that's shared okay. Perfect. And so I'm based here. So I'm just going to give you a whistle-stop tour and just fly through some sort of insights and some thoughts. So I'm based here in Plymouth. And I always show this image because I always think, wouldn't it be amazing if all of our buildings look like this? So that's the external living wall. You might see behind me is an internal living wall as well. So you're all welcome to come and visit if you're in the area. So some emerging insights. So my role is to facilitate and empower local businesses, particularly SMEs, to take action around climate change. So I'm the sort of facilitator or supporter of that change. And we do that for a number of different ways through Low Carbon Devon. But I'm just going to share some insights around my lived experience of what's coming up when working with businesses on a day-to-day basis. One of those emerging insights is carbon footprinting, particularly around businesses wanting to measure their own carbon footprinting. So they measure their own carbon footprint. So that's looking at their scope 1 and 2 emissions in particular, but also trying to dabble in this scope 3 emissions. And what does that mean and what does it look like? So exploring that as one area or one insight. Another thing is something called the B Corp certification, which keeps propping up in terms of businesses wanting to explore or dabble in and find out what that means and how it could work for them. This is a business-wide certification exploring social and environmental impact. So the need to get some sort of label or certification or accreditation to demonstrate business taking action is definitely an emerging insight. But also that climate change is real and that it's identified as a global threat. There's some research earlier this year from the World Economic Forum that actually climate change is on the agenda, although it might be not on the agenda of everyone. It is actually an emerging at the top of the agenda in terms of risks for businesses. Some particular challenges, though, to explore to try and facilitate positive action in this space. For me, there's often a sense of confusion around net zero. What does it mean? What does it look like? And how do all these other terms fit in? What's carbon positive or climate positive? How are they different? Actually, carbon positive is bad, but climate positive is good. So how do we use these terms, and how do we ensure we're not confusing people even more? So that's a particular challenge which is coming up. And also maybe recognizing the speed and scale of change that's required. So this is a journey that's plotted the net zero, if we were to be net zero by 2050, for example, which, as you can see, is a huge reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And if that's to be net zero by 2030, which is a lot of what people are pushing for, that's going to be even steeper decrease in emissions. So are we truly understanding the speed and scale of change? Do we necessarily understand what that means for our day-to-day operations? This is often sometimes called the carbon law by the Exponential Roadmap Initiative. It means we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by half every decade from now until 2050, which is a huge challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity. Another challenge, I think, is around consistency of support. So my role as a funded project at the university, for example, is working with local businesses. But when that role runs out, can those same local businesses afford a local consultancy to deliver that work? And I think, again, that's another challenge which is emerging in terms of who's carrying out this work, and is it affordable and accessible for everybody? Another thing I just thought I'd mention is around seeing this as a journey. I think there is a risk that net zero or taking action on climate change is a destination, but actually we need to view it as part of a journey, not the destination in itself, but it's part of a learning journey, and seeing net zero as a milestone, not necessarily the end of that journey. But I think there's also hope, and there's also lots of positive action in this space. This is one toolkit that I've been exploring, which explores, how can we move, if you go from sort of bottom left to top right of this diagram, so how can we move from sort of being less harmful to actually build capacity for justice and regeneration, and move beyond just doing things better, but actually exploring how we can see things differently and move to this space of repairing, regenerating, and replenishing. But what could aid this transformation? I just wanted to share a few sort of provocations around how we might facilitate this journey of regeneration. One of those, building on what Peter's shared, is around systems thinking, in terms of not viewing climate action. So this is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and as you can see, climate action number 13. So not viewing this in isolation, as in these separate individual boxes, but how can we view them more as a system, and how they interconnect and interrelate with each other, and ensuring that positive action on one goal doesn't mean negative action on another. So how can we view this as an interconnected web and system as itself? Just like this flock of starlings are working here to flow and collaborate with each other so they can move in the right direction. Another provocation is this notion of long-term thinking or cathedral thinking, in terms of how can we have this sense of cathedral thinking. And it's called cathedral thinking because people that built cathedrals generally knew that they were building or co-creating something that they wouldn't see the completion of, and that was beyond their human lifetimes. So hence the name cathedral thinking. So how can we as businesses or individuals co-create and build something that is beyond our human lifetimes? And we know that, and we know that we won't see the completion of it. This draws on some work around being a good ancestor. The Good Ancestor here by Roman Kuznekirk, which is how to think long-term in a short-term world. And also some pioneering work in Wales. There's a piece of legislation which has been touched upon today, the importance of legislation, called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which ensures that all public bodies in Wales have to consider the lives of people not even born yet when making decisions, which is incredible. Wouldn't it be amazing, if all governments and all businesses had that mindset? And moving on to the third point around embracing complexity. So how can we embrace complexity, as Peter touched upon complexity as well? So this is a scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions diagram of sort of mapping out what is the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for a business. And as you can see, it's pretty complex. And this is a simple version, but how can we break that down and ensure that that doesn't stop change? And actually, how can we embrace that complexity? Just like these leafcutter ants, for example, how can we build that sense of collaboration and work together so they can so we can help each other out and lessen that burden, but actually move in the right direction. And finally, imagination. I think there's a real key piece around how we can imagine a more beautiful future before we create it. Some wonderful work from James McKay exploring this around dreams of a low carbon future. And also we did a piece of work called the Net Zero Visions Project, inviting people to imagine their positive future. And then what does that look like? What does it feel like? And how can we share those stories? So this is a mural of a positive vision of Plymouth put together by one of our students. And lastly, we only have one Earth. It's a beautiful Earth. And this is the first ever photo of Earth from space called Earthrise. So how can we foster that sense of oneness whilst embedding all of those things that I've talked about in terms of collaboration, embracing complexity and in systems thinking, and not do this. This is one of my favorite images of people playing golf with a huge wildfire in the background. So how can we not do this, but actually look around us and wake up to the world around us, and take positive action for future generations. So there's a few provocations from me in terms of what I'm seeing in the business landscape, a few insights, but also a few things to think about and maybe complement what Peter shared around positive tipping points and maybe how we can sort of feed in together. So thanks for listening, and yeah, keen to discuss further.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. I think that's a really helpful setting of the context. Before I open it up more broadly, I just want to, I'm just going to share, while you were talking, I was mapping some of the things you were saying onto this Jamboard to kind of pick out, well, how might these ideas fit into this framework? So I think there are a few things you talked about that to me feel like really good examples of the conditions for change. So you talked about having affordable and consistent support, which is absolutely, that condition needs to be in place. We need to have that clarity of messaging. And I think that one of the things you touched at the beginning around carbon footprinting, the fact that this is a normalized thing, like, yes, we haven't got this right yet, and no business knows how it's going to reach net zero, or if that is even possible. The fact that this activity, this behavior is normalized, I think is a really important condition from which we can then get better at it. And then there are a few things you talked about that I think were nice examples of feedback loops in quite different ways. So one was you talked about the sort of support that's out there, an example of B Corp, which I know mentioned in the chat that that's not necessarily accessible to everybody, but there are lots of different communities and kind of collaborative spaces like that for businesses to come together. And again, that can act as a really important feedback loop for these things to emerge, for changes to emerge. And that last point you were making about imagination, again, it's a really important feedback loop. So these things don't have to be tangible and practical. If we can have activities or create spaces where collective imagination can be shared, again, that's something that reinforces our idea that change is possible, that we can reach it. And then I think two of the triggers that you mentioned are quite nice, different examples of that. One being the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, this bit of Welsh legislation that you talked about. Again, so that's a trigger. So that's a bit of legislation that comes in that changes the landscape. But the impact of that is going to be defined by what's already in place. Do we have things? Do we have things there? And then the other example, again, a really great different one, the Earthrise photo, which we do know was a real trigger for a lot of environmental movements and organizations starting up. And again, so what was the context in which that happened? Because that could have happened and had no real impact. It wasn't definitely going to be a trigger. So what was it about it that came at the right time? It was the right message at the right time. And again, I think what this framework is really is kind of good at looking at is saying we can't just focus on those moments and hope we get lucky. It's what is in place. What are the conditions in place? I think that was a really, really useful frame. Right, last thing I'm going to do is come back to the Mentimeter. So I'll put the link back in the chat, and I've got two questions before we sort of open it up to more of a discussion. So please do connect back to that one. And the first question in the second round is I've got this. I put the image of the tipping points journey up, and I want you to think about your sector. So whatever kind of business that you're involved in, either supporting or working directly, where do you think it is on that journey to becoming climate positive? So again, absolutely no right or wrong answer to this. There's no way to know who's put what, so it's totally anonymous. But it'd be really interesting just to see where people think that they are. And later on, I'd really invite people to share. If you want to share why you chose where you did, it'd be really interesting to see. So we're starting to see a kind of a cluster around that towards the sort of middle upper end of that resistance curve. We've got one person who thinks they're starting to get into the momentum, which is great. Love to hear more about that in a little bit. One person who's really way down at the sort of starting point, nearly just starting to go up that, climbing that hill. I'd love to know where the one on the far left is. There's even kind of reversing, getting worse, getting further away from the starting point, which again, is an assumption that might be negative, but potentially could be a positive depending on how you might be framing that. But again, a real cluster there towards the sort of middle upper, which I think is optimistic, and that's feels like a good place to be. We don't think we're past the tipping point in many instances towards positive change, but it's good to feel like we maybe are getting towards that. So yeah, thank you. Really interesting. I'll move on then. Last question, which I'm going to use to sort of frame this discussion of where we go from here, and would welcome questions for Chris and reflecting on the framework as well, is, okay, so what are the potential triggers then? So with everything you've heard from myself and from Chris, what do you think the things, so let's work backwards. So let's not think about the conditions for change or the feedback loops yet. What do you think are the potential triggers? So this might have some similarities to your answers in the earlier section around what would create momentum, but what are the things that when they happen could potentially trigger change, could tip us into a new state? So got some early answers of profit. So what does that mean in terms of a trigger? That would be my kind of response to that. There's got to be a change for a trigger to exist. So is it a sudden increase in profit, something that makes that different? Regulation, yeah, absolutely. So there could be a regulation, but let's get more specific. What kind of regulations could act as potential triggers? What sort of things are we seeing? Like the Welsh example that Chris spoke about future well-being regulation or legislation. Okay, so we've got some more examples now. So yeah, so cooperation, a mechanism to support cross-industry cooperation potentially. Demand changing. So if there is a demand for businesses that are climate positive, whatever that might mean. Public disorder, absolutely. Okay, so yeah, if there were riots on the streets, or petitions being signed left, right, and centre, or people kind of rising up and demanding a different approach. So again, money, but yeah, let's think about, well, what would the shift be within that money? So that could link to demand if people suddenly stop buying certain things. Changes in standards. Okay, right, measure of GDP. Right, yes. So if we suddenly had changed how we measured the success of a country from GDP, gross domestic product, to gross national happiness, for example. Clients asking for proof, great, absolutely, yeah, of what's being done. A carbon tax coming in, so that's obviously something that there's a lot of work in that space going on, but it's not clear exactly how that's going to operate. An election, yeah, really interesting, and interesting to look at examples that are happening at the moment in Brazil, the midterms in the US of A. Elections is a real point in time which can be a trigger. Really, yeah, one person in one business breaking the rules on purpose and the intent of the business, and clearing the space for others to do the same. Yeah, great example of a potential trigger. So that's one thing that happens that could lead to broader change, but isn't the change in and of itself. Again, we've got more legislation. Being climate friendly becomes cheaper. Yes, so that could be what's the tip into it suddenly becomes cheaper. Coordinated action, great example. Loads of ideas here. Donor economics, voting age reduced, brilliant. I'm sure we could continue here. Or just want to pick up on the a very bad accident, really interesting example that comes back to that point of climate impacts could be triggers. So feel free to keep putting in more, but this is a really great collection. And my question, my kind of last question to then sort of feed into the discussion and to start thinking about, well, how does this framework work in practice is, okay, so if these things happen tomorrow, would they lead to change? So that's the question. So if we had suddenly tomorrow the voting age reduced for young people, or suddenly donor economics became the normal economic model, which is something we'll talk about in the session next week, or there was a very bad accident, depending on what that means, or tomorrow there was a global famine, or tomorrow becoming climate friendly became cheaper than not, or legislation came in around impact on carbon, we had elections, or tomorrow one person in one business broke the rules on purpose. So all of these things, if they happen tomorrow, would they lead to change? And this is where the idea of the tipping points framework, I think, comes in to really explore what our response to that is. So if the answer is yes, we feel like that would lead to change, then that suggests the conditions for change are in place. They've been reinforced by the feedback loops, and we're at that point of being ready to tip. But if you feel actually, well, if that happened tomorrow, maybe it wouldn't have the impact, we wouldn't be ready for it. And it could potentially disappear, or it could get subsumed by the kind of the status quo and co-opted into a different way. Then the question is, okay, well, what would need to be in place? What would the conditions for change need to be? And that's kind of the essence of this this idea, of this model. So I'll stop sharing there. We could, there's a few kind of questions I get into, but there's some really interesting comments in the chat. So I wanted to sort of open up for a bit of questions and kind of discussion here. So that can be on the tipping points framework, on anything Chris has said, and Chris, I'd welcome you as well to come back in and reflect on any of that as well. But lots of really interesting points in the chat. But I'd invite anyone maybe to start us off, anyone that added something there or was thinking of a trigger. Do you think any of the triggers that you added, if they happen tomorrow, would lead to change? So that's an open question. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot with a particular idea, but Tim, you got your hand up. I'll come to you first.
Well, I was just going to say there's no way we can know, and there probably isn't. You can only tell these things with hindsight, looking back from a point of view in history. Yes, any of the potential things that have been suggested could lead to a change, but often it's even more complex than that, because it is multiple things that happen in different parts of the world, in different communities at slightly different times, which trigger something. So I think from where we are, it's impossible to predict. Maybe in a century's time, they can say, yes, these are the trigger points, but we're still arguing about what exactly caused the First World War.
Yeah, I think it's a really good example, and yeah, completely agree. There is no possible way to predict. So this framework is not a kind of a fortune-telling device that will tell us exactly what's going to happen in the future, but it is a way for us to think about, well, if change is coming, what is that emerging change likely to be? So Jonathan's put in the chats the invasion of the Ukraine could be a potential trigger. Absolutely. So again, we're thinking about, we're noticing these early warning indicators. So change is happening. We're seeing the change within the price of energy and energy resilience. We're seeing it in how behavior is shifted and what's important for people. But yes, it's definitely too early to say what the outcome of that is going to be. But clearly the conditions were in place for a change to emerge. And this is a key thing about the tipping points is, the tipping point is not the change. It's not the end point. So what we need to get better at noticing is when that change is starting to happen. And then how do we build in, how do we try and respond to that as it's happening? So absolutely, as you say, Tim, we'll probably never know exactly, this caused that, caused this, because of it's a complex system. It's not a complicated system. We can't totally understand everything that's going on. But if we can think about what is likely to emerge from this, I think that helps us as individuals, as organizations, but also from the context of businesses to understand what is our role within that, within the wider system. How is the system changing? What changes emerging, and how might we respond to that? So some loads of really interesting points on chat, and I'd welcome anyone to jump in and talk to any of those points, because I don't want you to have to just listen to my voice for the rest of the session. So please do unmute and jump in, or put your hand up if you want to talk to any of those things. But there are some really interesting ideas around the COVID pandemic being a trigger. Absolutely. So that's something that again, it's hard to know exactly how that's going to fall out, but that's clearly was a point where the A system was changing. But do we tip back, or do we continue? David, I saw your hand, so I'll come to you next.
Yeah, sure. For me, I got involved in non-violent civil disobedience in 2019, something I've never done, never been involved in my life, never even thought about being involved in, until I read all the science and understood where we were coming from as part of the Extinction Rebellion. And I met lots of people like me who had never done anything like that before, but didn't see what else to do. And I think that nothing is perfect, and that certainly wasn't perfect, but that, and then all the things that have happened afterwards, which all have some relationship to our changing climate and the issues around biodiversity. It's building a momentum, and that momentum is continuing to build and build.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I think that's a really good example of where that momentum is happening, and something that we need to continue that momentum to overcome the resistance that it is facing. But again, thinking about, well, what might that lead to? And I think civil disobedience, direct action is a really good example of something where you can see how it may well lead to change, but there's a few different potential scenarios that we might get to. So one might be that it achieves its impact and has the change it's trying to get to. Another potential scenario is that we get, as we're starting to see in some instances, more draconian policies that restrict the right to protest and the ability for people to protest. So again, there's a potential scenario. We can see that there might be a shift, but that shift could be potentially co-opted. And again, it could be a similar thing for businesses in a lot of ways, as mentioned the example of divestment before as well. So yeah, we can see that change is happening. There is momentum gathering, but what is the emerging system that is ready to take the place of the one that we're currently in? Again, I think there's some really interesting ideas to that in the chat. And I think one point to really emphasize here is the point on resistance, as well as reinforcing feedbacks. So feedbacks that support this change to emerge. There are also what are called dampening feedbacks. And so these are feedback loops that stop change from emerging. So things that kind of keep the current system at play. So one example of a dampening feedback loop might be advertising. You know, advertising is a system that keeps a certain behavior and information and attitude in the kind of the populace, you know, kind of tells people to buy certain things, to continue buying things. It's a very kind of dominant message. That's one of the things that we would, you know, if we want to get to a system where people use less or reuse or don't buy as much, that is a feedback loop that needs to be removed, because otherwise it's creating so much resistance that it's very hard to move through. Dennis, yeah, I see your hand up. You're still on mute, Dennis.
All right. When you look at social change historically and see the way, you know, substantial reorganization of society and economics have taken place, it's been a very gradual thing, and that's happened over a very long time. Our time frame is 10 years at best. And the social change that needs to take place is going to affect the economics, the value systems that we have, a whole variety of things, the international relationships. And it doesn't seem that we have a chance of making that timetable work without the intervention of state actors. And also the enough state actors to gain the momentum internationally. How do you see that situation?
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, we do need, clearly we need intervention from states, from governments. We need that legislation. I think there's a danger just within businesses to fixate on innovation as the thing that is going to save us. You know, oh, we'll figure out carbon capture and storage or XYZ. We can also fixate on, oh, well, we'll wait until the policy comes in. And you can draw lines between, well, if we get enough, if we get the conditions in place and people are electing leaders who have these more progressive policies or perspectives, we can see how that might lead to change. But actually, as has been said by others and in the chat, it is a complex system. And so we can't hope to completely understand it. But I think what this framework can do is help us, yes, acknowledge the need for state actors to play their part and to not assume that we have control over that. But when those things emerge, when someone comes through and they are in power, they have the opportunity to implement a new policy, are the conditions in place to support that and to make it successful? And elections are really good examples of that, but there are many, many others of, you know, how bills might get through Parliament. Is there public support for that? And I think this is a way of using this framework is a way that businesses, communities, any organization can locate themselves in that wider system and think, well, we're not going to individually change the actions of a state actor. But if we can help cultivate the right conditions for change to emerge in by sharing information, making it accessible, making it desirable, building critical mass, building social networks, then when that change emerges, when it's ready, it's much more likely to take root. And I think that's one of the things that this framework can help with. Chris,
there's a Greek concept, of kairos, which is the moment when change is possible. And the idea is that unless you're ready for that moment, you can't really take advantage of it. And I think it's a wonderful concept.
Put that in the chat. I'd love to. That sounds, yeah, really, really pertinent. David, I'll come to you and then Chris.
I just wanted to come back on a couple of things, which may not seem positive. So the legislation that's been brought in as a reaction to lots of civil disobedience is obviously not a good thing, but perhaps it is the reaction of those who are so frightened they don't know what else to do, and maybe that's why we are very near a tipping point, a positive tipping point. And the other thing, just from what Dennis was saying, I think it's really true. We obviously need the state to step in, but the state will only step in, generally speaking, those who run the state, when it suits their purposes and they get re-elected. And if there are enough people, businesses, and all sorts of things changing and showing that change, that's where the state will have no option but to do so.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I think that's a really good point and a really good example of how, when you view things as a system, is very it makes it easier to not see things as the end of the story. So not see policies that make civil disobedience or protest harder, not to see them, well, that's the end of the story, because as you say, well, that could be the next step on more public outcry in support of the right to protest, for example. And so again, it's what are the conditions that are in place when this change happens that will determine what kind of trigger it is, what's the new state that emerges. Chris and then Saul.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. When you were talking earlier, I thought of an example which I thought might be interesting to share in terms of sort of highlighting the importance of those conditions, and not necessarily the actual tipping point, but the bit that comes before that, was in terms of the example of the Paris Agreement in 2015 or 14-15, and that actually it wasn't the agreement itself, but it was all the stuff that led up to that agreement and all the work that was put in place foster those relationships and foster those collaborations, to have those conversations before COP15, I think it was at the time. And there's a really good book, if you haven't read it, The Future We Choose by Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac, who were the instigators of the Paris Agreement. And the work they put in place, building the relationships and building the conversations before the actual Paris Agreement and before COP, was way more important than the actual COP itself, because they nurtured those conditions, they nurtured those relationships, they allowed people to listen to each other. And I just think that shows the importance of the spaces in between and the conversations in between, in terms of, you know, for example, I'm a surfer, and it's not actually surfing that is, you only spend a tiny amount of your time actually surfing. It's the spaces in between the waves where the magic happens, and where you move, and where you get your sense of perspective. And that's quite a nice example, because I think it's the spaces in between that we can have as businesses, the conversations that we have with our employees in between meetings, not necessarily in the meetings themselves, where that nurtures those conditions. So I think, you know, the role that we have as citizens, as employees, to have those conversations or to nurture those conditions in the spaces in between is so vital. And that's something we can start doing right away. You know, sharing that we've been to this event, we had a conversation about positive tipping points, and then that will trigger another conversation, etc., etc. So I just thought that was useful to share.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I love that. And I think it's, I mean, we've only got 10 minutes left. So it's you know, obviously this is a very kind of condensed conversation. We could go much longer, but I think that's a really good example of how can businesses locate themselves within a wider system of change and notice those little things, and not feel overwhelmed by, oh, we have to just inform policy, we have to lobby for change that feels out of reach. But actually, if we are creating those conditions for positive change to emerge, that is a really important part of the process. I think that can be quite a heartwarming idea. Saul, and then Francesca.
Oh yeah, I guess it's picking up on a point that Chris mentioned, and it's just about the amount of sort of terminology about carbon positive, carbon negative, net zero, all of these different things and these different frameworks. And I guess, how do you address that to kind of have some real clarity, so everyone can kind of build on it and really develop a true understanding of what it is, and kind of get that kind of groundswell and that momentum, so that people kind of do understand these terms and these phrases, or sort of whittle them down? Do you think that's going to be like a regulatory thing where people won't be able to use these terms, or how do you kind of see that playing out in terms of the sort of mass adoption and wider participation?
Yeah, Chris, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, thanks, Sol. So me and Sol know each other. So yeah, it's a great question. I think it's just yeah. It is confusing, but I think once you actually understand what they mean, I think it's just moving beyond the you know, the other phrase of greenwashing, in terms of, you know, lots of these terms have come from marketing, as you'll know, and sort of, so I mentioned a few of them, you know, but if you just think about it and look through the process, like carbon positive is actually bad, because we don't want more carbon, we want to be carbon negative. But climate positive is good, but you could argue it's not a technical term, climate positive, whereas carbon negative and carbon positive are technical terms. So it's a net zero and carbon neutral, and it's sort of like, well, you know, my understanding is that carbon neutral only incorporates scope 1 and 2 emissions, and doesn't include scope 3 emissions, which are most people's emissions. But net zero does include scope 3 emissions. So being net zero is the term that I think is going to rise above the rest, in terms of, are you truly net zero? So yeah, I think we could talk longer about it, but it's just delving a little bit deeper. So when I see things now on people's websites of like, oh, this company is X, Y, and Z, I try and look at the detail and think, well, how have they worked that out? You know, how have they come to that conclusion? And you can quite easily tell within sort of 5 or 10 minutes whether, you know, people are saying, or people actually know what they're saying. So it's just having that critical mindset, I think, you know, that critical thinking and actually saying, okay, that's interesting, but how did you work that out? And not doing that in a place of anger or frustration, but doing it from a place of curiosity and wanting to learn and explore.
Yeah, I guess it's more about kind of, to my mind, the general public as a whole kind of might not necessarily, it's almost kind of, they might need to be sort of spoon fed it, and they won't have that kind of critical mindset, or even kind of think scope 1, 2 and 3. Like that's all kind of, I mean, it's relatively new terminology to me in the last sort of year. And so it's for the mass sort of people, I think it's not necessarily going to be something that they're familiar with or even sort of interested in, whereas if it's just that kind of top level kind of, I just get that as a statement and I kind of know it to be true because, you know, it's been backed up or verified in some way. It's definitely like more work needs to be done on it, and it's an interesting one to explore.
Yeah, definitely, and it's really difficult, but yeah, I know what you mean. But yeah, thanks all.
Cheers.
I think that's
what about Joe? Do you have a? Oh, sorry, Peter.
Well, just conscious of time, and I want to bring Joe in. I think that's a really good as well example of, you know, net zero is kind of, you know, a ubiquitous phrase at the moment, but it's likely that in 10 years' time, net zero might not be the language that we're using, because there's more awareness that maybe that doesn't mean what we thought it meant. And so again, you know, thinking about what's the wider change that we're trying to cultivate, how do we make sure we don't, you know, anchor ourselves too much to an idea that might well change, and keep that bigger picture in mind. So yes, maybe we need to talk about net zero at the moment, but if we spend too much energy trying to convince the public about net zero, and then in 5 years' time it's a new phrase that's come along, you know, actually, do we step back? What's the wider idea that we want to be creating or cultivating, and much more about values and, you know, this idea of what the future might look like. But I'm sure we spend a whole session on that. Joe, bring you in here.
Thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating. I work for Winchester Action on Climate Change, and we are a charity, small, but been around for a decade, excuse me, trying to enable and enthuse people locally in communities to take action on the climate, and identify business as a specific kind of community, if you like. We're looking at how to engage with that when we sort of anticipate that businesses prefer to listen to the business world than some small community charity, even if there's a growing realization about the issue and its impact on all walks of life. And I was thinking, I wonder if either of you have comments on, in the face of long-standing climate activists, if you like, who feel like this is so urgent, we must do things to reduce carbon right now. There isn't time for this relationship building, seed planting, you know, the nourishing element, which I completely identify with, that you've described as being important for a long-term picture. But there's a tension between that sense of, but we've got to do it right now. And in particular, how can you do this collaboration effectively if other players in the collaborative team, if you like, don't see the systems view? Because one of my answers to that challenge is we can't wait for everybody to be on the same page and think exactly the same. We have to somehow forge our way forward with difference and with a respect for the fact that we're coming at it from different points of view. But it seems to me quite fundamental, that framework of thinking, which is either the big picture and you can see the interconnections, or the sort of more linear, we want to be in this for what we can get out of it ourselves, or so that we can solve it. Anyway, that's a lot of stuff, but I just wondered if either of you had any comment. Thanks.
That's great, Joe. Yeah, and a great question to kind of help us wrap up and bring this to a close, I think. Chris, welcome your thoughts in a second. From a tipping points perspective, I think that phrase you mentioned, forge forwards with difference, is key, because, you know, one of the things about the tipping points framework is it acknowledges that we're all doing different things and we're all kind of trying to, well, not all, but many of us trying to move in the same direction. But one of the helpful things about viewing complexity and systems is we don't have to have the same exact vision of where we need to get to. We know that there needs to be change, but no one can totally control what that change is going to look like. So I think, you know, we've talked before about a protest and direct action. And I think, you know, think about the difference between Extinction Rebellion and other sort of social movements is a really great example of Extinction Rebellion have a really clear place there, and they are lobbying and they are pushing. And then there are other groups that are doing more kind of sort of softer, slower work with communities and governments. And we could argue about which was more effective, but the point is that they're both cultivating conditions that either one couldn't do on their own. And I think it's the same with businesses. You know, you've got outliers like Patagonia who are doing some really interesting stuff. Again, you know, whatever your feelings on exactly what that means is, with businesses, I think it helps us understand that we are all cultivating these conditions for change. We're trying to push towards that tipping point, and then really think about, well, what change might we get to? But we don't have to spend ages and ages trying to come up with a single unique vision, because we can't possibly control exactly what that looks like. But if we acknowledge that something does need to change, that gives us a commonality, I think, that businesses can work on, and people who absolutely want to do some impactful stuff right now, which is really key. But that impactful stuff right now is not going to have a huge impact. It's going to be another part of creating the conditions for the bigger impact that no one actor or agent can do individually. I think so. That would be, yeah, my thoughts. Chris, I don't know, and others, I'd welcome other responses to that, because it's such a key question.
Yeah, I can try. I'd love to chat further, but I can try and summarize in sort of 20 seconds. I think, because I often think this as well, but for me, it's around sort of being beautifully patient and being sort of active and compassionate listeners. Because I think, nobody likes being told what to do, but they might like to be shown the way, or be part of the story. So it's just, for me, it's listening is so important, and being open to listen. So it may be slowing down in order to speed up. One of my favorite phrases is slow is fast. And I think that's so relevant. So remembering that we might need to slow down in order to speed up. And also just try and engage people in the beauty, awe and wonder of the world, because then I think it takes care of itself. I mean, it's not as simple as that, but remember to connect with beauty and awe and wonder.
Thanks, Chris. That's lovely. Right, I noticed we're at 2 minutes past half past now, so I want to bring this to a close. It's been a real whistle stop tour of tipping points and of climate positive business and these ideas. So hopefully just getting this conversation started. Obviously there's, this is a broader conversation, much broader, that I imagine you're all part of in many different ways. Very briefly, in terms of next steps, as I mentioned, this framework, this idea of positive tipping points is a very live one. All of the feedback and ideas that are coming out of these workshops, I'm going to bring back in to the academic research that's going on, and make sure that informs any kind of future activities. So next year there'll be more events, there'll be another conference, I'm sure, more resources created that make this framework something that can be applied in practice, and really build it up into something that makes sense at different levels of scale. You're all absolutely encouraged to be a kind of a really active part of that, because, as I said, it's really important that this doesn't just exist in the academic space, and that it's tested and prodded and critiqued by all sorts of people. So what I will do is I'll harvest the chat, some really interesting ideas in the chat, and add those to the follow-up email with a link to the recording, some further resources and reading if you want to get more into this idea of tipping points, and then I'll keep you all updated with what happens next. But it's an open conversation. Please do get in touch with me if you want to find out more, you want to share any thoughts, or think about how this might work in your particular environment, your kind of ecosystem, whatever that might be. Yeah, you should have my email address if you signed up to the event, but I'll just put it in the chat as well, so you've got it there. Thank you so much for coming. I'll end it there. Do feel free to get in touch, and lovely to spend this time with you all. So thanks a lot.